Hello. Today we're going to continue talking about the molecules that are important to living things. So start by just reviewing a little bit what you remember from general biology about organic molecules, what that means and what the main groups of them are. Over the next few days, we are going to be reviewing the main groups of organic molecules in living things. We'll be looking at the structure using those molecule cards that you started sorting out yesterday. And we'll talk about how those structures allow them to do the functions that they need to do within living things. Today, however, we're going to talk about just kind of the backbone, the carbon structure of all organic compounds. The most important thing about an organic compound is that it contains carbon. They usually also contain hydrogen and oxygen, but carbon is the one that kind of defines an organic compound. The only reason to really remember that it includes hydrogen is that carbon dioxide is usually not considered an organic compound because there's no hydrogen. Carbon's a really, really important element in living things. Other than water, carbon makes up about 2/3 of the rest of living things if you take out all the water. And so it's really, really important to building the major molecules made up in living things. One of the reasons that it's so important is that it can form 4 chemical bonds. And so we're going to look at how those bonds work. So take a look at these pictures and see what this looks like if carbon uses all single bonds and if it includes a double bond in the structure of this molecule. If carbon forms all single bonds, you have 4 single bonds that are going out at different angles, and you get this shape called a tetrahedron. It's a tetrahedral shape. It looks kind of like a pyramid or something. If there's a double bond in the molecule, then it gets a much flatter shape. You saw how the middle part of that molecule was mostly flat. That's also called a planar shape. Most often, carbon bonds with hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So it's important that you know how many bonds each of those will create. That's referred to as its valence. The word valence doesn't just refer to valence electrons. In this sense, it refers to the number of unpaired valence electrons. In other words, the number of chemical bonds it can form. So those are some things that you should know so that you can look at chemical structures and kind of understand what you're seeing. Most of the major organic molecules have a carbon skeleton as kind of the foundation of that molecule. And so these carbon skeletons can be really complex and really diverse because carbon is able to form 4 different bonds, and it can form single bonds and double bonds in a huge array of patterns, and it can bond to lots of other elements. So these carbon skeletons can be straight chains right down the middle of a molecule. They could branch off into different sections, or they could be those ring type structures. And as you sorted out your molecules yesterday, you probably noticed some of all 3 of those. If a double bond is included in the molecule, the position of that double bond can also vary. Some of these molecules are really large. So you could have the double bond in the middle, it could be closer to one end or the other, and that can also affect the structure and therefore the function of these molecules. So take a look at the molecules that are built here and make some observations. Both of those molecules are molecules of C8H18, which I really just picked because it was something buildable with the materials we had. And you may have noticed that even though they included the exact same elements, they didn't look the same. Those are what are called isomers. They're made of the same atoms, but in a different arrangement. Specifically, that example was showing you something called a structural isomer, where they're arranged differently. Here's an example of another one. This type of isomer is called a cis-trans isomer. Cis has the 2 functional groups, those 2 unique parts on the same side of the double bond, and trans has them on opposite sides. So this is only possible with carbons that are double bonded together. If there's a single bond, then that molecule can rotate, so it doesn't really matter where those functional groups are located. But with a double bond, it's much less flexible, and so the position of those other groups of atoms can be really important to how that molecule functions. Here's another type of isomer. That one is called an enantiomer, which is a mirror image. They look very similar, but they're not quite the same. And that's only possible if the carbon is attached to 4 completely different atoms. This can have huge consequences. It might seem like a minor change to us, but it can have huge consequences for how those molecules function in living things. You can look up some examples of that if you would like to learn a little more about that and see how different those effects can be. Some molecules that only contain carbon and hydrogen are referred to very obviously as hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are not frequently found in living things. They're actually molecules that make up a lot of fuels like petroleum and ethanol and things like that. But there are a lot of organic molecules that have large regions, big parts of the molecule that are only made of carbon and hydrogen. The important things to think about are these kinds of questions. If you have a big section of a molecule that's only carbon and hydrogen, is that polar or nonpolar, and why? And how will that affect how it behaves in water? Because living things are mostly made of water. Hopefully you remembered that carbon and hydrogen have pretty much equivalent electronegativities, which means that any bonds between carbon and hydrogen are going to be nonpolar, which means these molecules, hydrocarbons, will not mix well. They will not dissolve with water. So that's an important thing to realize. Any biomolecules with large hydrocarbon regions are not going to mix well with water. They are a good place to store energy, and they can release a lot of energy in chemical reactions. So you'll see those in some of the biomolecules that we look at as well. So as we start studying these different groups of biomolecules, you'll look at the carbon skeleton of each one, and that's one of the things that will help us to recognize them. But there are a couple other parts that the properties of these biomolecules depend on as well. That basic skeleton determines the shape of the molecule, and for a lot of them, the shape determines how that molecule is going to function in living things. The other piece that's really important in looking at molecules and how they function is what are called functional groups. Functional groups are little clumps of atoms that are attached to that carbon skeleton, and they're usually the parts of the molecule that are directly involved in chemical reactions. There's a list of these on page 47 of your textbook, which looks like this. And this is actually something that you are going to need to learn and memorize because I'm going to talk about these frequently. Excuse me. So for each chemical group, you can see it tells you kind of the chemical elements that make it up and shows you a picture of it. This is a hydroxyl group. This is mainly what you need to memorize. You do not need to know the compound name. You need to be able to recognize the chemical group. You also need to be able to recognize it in an example. You don't need to know the names of the example, but if I give you this diagram of the molecule, you should be able to look and identify and say, look, there's an OH hanging off there. That is a hydroxyl group. So the hydroxyl group is one that we see frequently in biology. That's an oxygen-hydrogen group. A carbonyl group is a carbon double bonded to an oxygen. And if you combine these two, you get something called a carboxyl group. That's a carbon double bonded to an oxygen with the oxygen-hydrogen group down there. So it's kind of that whole thing. An amino group is one that'll be really important as we start talking about amino acids, which you may have heard of before. They all contain this NH2 group. A sulfhydryl group is a pretty easy one to remember because the sulfur is right and hydrogen are both right there in the name. Phosphate groups are super important for energy transfer in living things. That's a PO4 group, or sometimes it exists as a PO3 ion. And a methyl group is a carbon with 3 hydrogens attached to it. I'm going to put up a little quiz where you can practice these, but this is something that you will definitely need to study and review because I actually will quiz you on these probably in about a week. As you look at all those functional groups and start studying those, you'll notice that most of them are hydrophilic, which means that they're at least partly attracted to water, which of course will affect how those bigger biomolecules respond in water as well. All of them are reactive except the methyl group. The methyl group is that CH3, and since it's all carbon and hydrogen, it's completely nonpolar and does not tend to be very reactive. The rest of them participate a lot in the chemical reactions within living things. And as I said, the phosphate group is often involved in transferring energy. And one place that you've probably heard of that before is in the molecule ATP. The TP is triphosphate. So it has 3 of those phosphate groups attached to it. When one of them breaks off, that releases energy and makes it adenosine diphosphate. So phosphates are really important in transferring energy. So, like I said, I will give you some ways to practice these so that you can memorize these different functional groups and recognize them in molecules. We'll be talking about them not only through this unit, but throughout the rest of the year as we talk about how these biomolecules work. So that's it for the lecture today. We're going to start the next part of the pattern matching activity today, but we're going to continue working on it on Thursday as well. So if you're in House A, I will post the instructions today, and if you have time today, start going through your molecule cards again. Today we're actually going to start sorting out the amino acids, the molecules that are parts of proteins. That'll kind of be our first group that we study. You will have some time to finish this in class on Thursday, though, so if you don't get it completely done at home, that's okay. If you're a distance learner, the instructions will be posted on Classroom today, and they'll also be added to the homework post where your Jamboard is. You can work on this today or tomorrow or Thursday, but I would ask that you complete this second part by the end of the day on Thursday so that you've had a chance to find and identify all of those amino acids out of your molecules. The information we've been learning today was mostly out of chapter 2. So if you like to use the textbook to review, this slide just kind of shows you where we are. Like I said, on Thursday, we're going to start moving into some other parts of section 3 and looking more closely at these groups of biomolecules. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you again soon.